Hi guys, welcome back to Immersive Sports Science. And on these cold, dark days, we're going to be talking about the FIFA World Cup. Slightly warmer and more controversial place called Qatar. We're not going to talk about the politics of this particular World Cup because, well, we're an apolitical channel. What I will say is that 500 people building a stadium and dying is not really called for. We wish those who actually died during the tournament, as well as those who died building the stadium and the infrastructure, commiserations for those families who had to suffer. You have Immersive Sports Science and my sympathies. The problem is with a lot of the research coming out is that for this particular World Cup, it won't come out. For the 2018 World Cup, most of the research only came out this year, with the vast majority of the research most likely coming out next year or the year after. Due to the slow pace and nature of peer-reviewed research, it's highly unlikely that the 2022 World Cup research will come out anytime soon. Let's face it, we're not exactly going to click on a video for the 2022 World Cup in 2030, are we? Even though we are lacking research, scientific research, we then have to rely on analytical data that people generally on the internet or other companies have put out freely available. Now, these may not necessarily be statistically accurate, but they're the best we've got. With the World Cup being unusually in winter this year, during the main part of the season, there's been two main theories about who will fatigue, or will they not fatigue. Generally during this time of the year, it's often the heaviest part of the season, or the main part of the season, so there's a good theory that maybe the players would be at peak condition. Nonetheless, there was another conveying theory leading into this World Championships, that being that maybe the players will be tired because it is the high part of the season. Normally when a season happens, you would have the games going in, and then roughly around about November, December, usually January, February, most of the leagues will have their winter break where they will go warm weather training. And if they're dumb enough, or the teams fancy they want a bit more extra cash, they might whack an extra game on that no one really pays any attention to. With the exception of the English League, in which case they come quick and fast this time of the year, because people are off, therefore around about December time they whack on a load of games, so that people can actually watch those games, and thusly the teams make more money. And with the exceptions of the African Cup of Nations, most teams will go through the season, and then they'll have their major competitions in the summer months. Now, what you usually get is often a 6-week break period, in which case players can have like a week off, then get back to it, get prepared coming off that season for the summer period, for the summer competition. Cup competitions are a lot different to league competitions. League competitions are a marathon. Cups is more about a series of sprints, is the best way I can describe it. And when we're talking about cup tournaments, we're talking about end-of-season cup tournaments, not necessarily the Champions League or FA Cup or anything like that. We are not talking about domestic cup tournaments. Usually, throughout the season, the players who start the season aren't necessarily the players who finish the season due to injuries and other factors. Players get better as the season goes on, some players get worse, get more fatigued, etc, etc. With a cup tournament, what you get is players build into it, but generally the best players at the beginning of the cup tournament, because there's only roughly around about 7 or 8 games in a World Cup, will be the best players at the end of the tournament. They might not necessarily get the most game time, but strategies have to adapt quickly during the World Cup. Then after the World Cup, what you get is a post-season, and the post-season is yet again normally 6 weeks. The Premier League's a little bit different. They start in August, so they only get about 3-4 weeks at most, in which time they have to deload, prepare, and then prepare themselves again for the following season with pre-season training, which is often harder. In any sport, the pre-season training is often the hardest training of the year. It prepares you for the actual season. And they have to squeeze that in such a smaller space, such a small amount of time. And I don't think people realise how strenuous that can be leading into the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Certain leagues, like the English Premier League, try to cram as many games in as they possibly could before the actual tournament, rather than doing what would be the most logical thing, is cut the games off completely and then replay them, extending the season on. For some reason they didn't do that, or just do a normal season rather than try and cram them all in. Thusly, The theory is that the players were fatigued leading in. Give you an example, Tottenham's son. In October, Tottenham had 18 games in which he played 13 games in that month alone. So Tottenham were playing roughly every 2 days, more or less, with Son playing round about every 3 to 4 days. Now, in terms of distance covered, goalkeepers ran almost half the distance of the rest of the team. Shock horror, that's not going to surprise anyone. However, they were moving a lot quicker and a lot faster compared to other goalkeepers at other World Cups, suggesting they are a lot fitter and a lot better than they have been in the past. Also, this could be because of the rise of the 12th, 11th man principle. In other words, the goalkeeper is the 11th outfield player and utilised in such a way where they can help with the attacks and passing and help maintain the ball, not just as a shot stopper. And I don't think people realise how strenuous that can be upon the body. Playing 90 minutes of football is equivalent to potentially, depending on position, running the same amount of distance as a Mo Farah 5,000 or a 10,000 metre race. Yes, I do realise that people are walking during a football game and they aren't necessarily walking in a running race, and the fact that you are doing short sprints more or less, whereas in a running race the only real sprint is that long sprint at the end on the final lap. Now, bear in mind there are limitations with this research. We don't know how long they're holding that speed for. Are they reaching their top speed within a second and dropping off, or are they maintaining that top speed over 30-40 metres? Bearing in mind that in football you don't really sprint over 40 metres often. You barely reach 30 metres most of the time. And of course there is so much context involved here as well. For instance, centre-backs don't often sprint as much into the middle of the field because there's normally less room for them to move. Whereas outfield players, there's generally greater room for them to move. So therefore, they will often run and sprint further. If you are a slower player, you generally hang off the incoming player. So when they do sprint, you're able to then potentially compete with them. So there's loads of context here that we have to apply. You also have to apply the game tactics and the game state itself. If it's a scrappy game, or they're on you quickly, there's not going to be room for you to move that often. If you're a possession team, like Spain, you like to play ticky-tacky football, in which case you're passing the ball all the time. There's not much actual running and movement off the ball. Interestingly, we also know that the referees, as well as the linesmen, covered more ground at this World Cup than they have done at previous World Cups since testing has begun. Referees are being more proactive in terms of their movements. They generally are fitter. Nonetheless, just because a referee is fitter doesn't necessarily mean they are good referees. Very highly subjective. Yes, we can monitor the decisions they have made correctly, yet again, that is also subjective. At this World Cup, there were more officials, on-field officials, than there has been at any other World Cup. However, the level of officiating was somewhat questionable, even though the laws of the game are pretty definitive in their writing, and many pundits questioned the quality of that officiating. So, what do we know from stats-wise about the officiating? There was more fouls previously in the 2018 World Cup and in this World Cup. Now, we've got to take this with a pinch of salt because most of this has come from Qatar, but there was a 98% accuracy of the referee's decision making in both World Cups, even though they played less games. One thing that has been called into the question is the quality of the VAR, the video action replay referees, and what they seen is necessarily being effective in preventing those fouls, which is what they were meant to do. They are meant to stop clear and obvious errors from the referee. Now, some VAR referees were very good, other VAR referees weren't so much. And also the quality of their decisions, the consistency of their decisions has also become questionable. And let's take this decision against England in the England versus Iran game. Two very similar decisions, two very similar situations, yet two very different results. We've also got to look at the Colombian official here, who has become into question from the Court of Arbitration, as he may necessarily need to go to court over his really inconsistent decisions. Why are they so inconsistent? Is there something a little bit more nefarious going on? But IFAB, who create the laws of the game, that's not FIFA, IFAB, the International Football Association Board, is a lot older than FIFA, are generally a little bit more conservative when it comes to using, well no, that's not correct. They're conservative in some respects and really expansive, really modern in other respects. They don't particularly want it to, well, they're basically an old gits who decided that we want to use it, but we don't really want to use technology, or that's at least the perception I've got from speaking to certain officials. This is highly problematic in certain respects. The way the technology is implemented, it's no longer in beta. VAR has been in beta really for the last 4 or 5 years. This year was the last year, or you could argue that the year before was the last year it was finally put into place and not in a beta testing anymore. I know for a lot of you that will be quite shocking to hear that it was in beta testing for at least 4 or 5 years, but it has to be in order to get it right, in order to get it good enough for the elite game. Now, likewise, it's not necessarily the technology that's incorrect or bad. In fact, the new technology, the VAR offside, which you can see a video up there, was exceedingly good. It's, we need further information, but it's a lot better than it has been. So it's not the technology that's the problem. The problem lies with how one interprets those decisions. You're either onside or you're offside. It's either a foul or it's not a foul. It's either a goal or not a goal, more or less nowadays. It's more or less a binary decision in this modern era. Then your determination of what you consider foul will be different to mine, even though the laws of the game are pretty damn clear. Where a referee has to be at its fittest is what they see here. The development of England utilising for their set pieces and corners colloquially has many different names, one of them being the love train. Yeah, because they're all lined up, crushed. Yeah, you kind of get the point, crushed the bum, whatever. But this was highly effective in terms of, and highly revolutionary. Before this, the best form of defending a corner was through the use of zonal, and to score a corner is very difficult. It's the most common form of set piece, yet has the least amount of goals. And ironically, the short corner is the best form of corner, because what happens is the tradition is that once you pass it short, subconsciously or through training, you try and clear the box out. But by clearing the box out, you make it easier to score because there's less people inside the box. So when you do get your shot in, it's more likely to go through. When defending corners, zonal was the best form of defense, because when someone runs into the space, you had someone to cover, or at least multiple people to cover. Now, regardless of this, the perception, mainly from old school lot, was that you had to defend man to man, woman to woman. And the reason being is because it looks better, it's perceptionally better, because you always got someone on somebody. If you have their best header, you stick your best header on them. Now the problem, it looks better perceptionally. If a goal was to happen from a zonal, it can look pretty bad perceptionally, even though it is statistically the best form of defence at the time. Perceptions aside, football at the time was generally old school thinking, and to a certain extent in IFAB it's still the same. To a certain extent in FIFA it's still the same. Nonetheless, we've developed on that. We've utilised sports science to help us understanding and how to improve corner. And what the love train has done is improved the number of goals by twofold from corners, because it's actually very hard to defend. The problem with zonal defense is when if you've got a strict zone, let's say you had a load of squares, players being at each corner, someone being inside that square, you have to have someone pick that person up. And it's always very difficult when you have someone running into space, running through the zones, and they would generally get a free pass. The problem with man-to-man is that you end up neutralising your best header. Sticking the best person on the best person can potentially lead with the both of them in nullifying each other, allowing someone else to score. Also, it eliminates the fact that you can get for zonal, the benefit is that you get multiple people on that one person, prevent them scoring. The Italian way of defending corners is to have your best person back, And then what it is, where the ball is, they move into that space. So you're still defending man to man, woman to woman, but you have your best player moving in to help them, hanging back. But now the problem is, as you can imagine, what you can do if you're clever enough is donk a ball straight on and get a load of people running to that best person. So they're tracking back, but they're unable to defend the header because the other people have got a head start on them running in, getting the power to be able to jump higher than them. What the love train did is, if you're defending man to man, which was the most common form of defense at the time, even though it's not statistically the best at the time, is you can't pick up the man you're wanting to mark because they're all in the line. You then have to judge where they're going to run to. And if your person runs the opposite side to you, it creates more spaces to header. With zonal defences, the problem is that these guys end up running off into those spaces, running through the zones, making it harder to pick up. Beforehand, people used to be pretty stationary inside the actual box itself, waiting for the corner. Now they're not. They're getting a run in. They're developing pace. Once you've got a bit of power, you can jump higher. You're not stationary, which is easier to defend. A moving player is harder to defend.
Now, historically, corners were very static, and people used to defend corners very statically. But movement is very harder to defend against, especially players moving into space. When it comes to defending the train, nowadays there are two different ways you can potentially do it without fouling the player. Here against Sampdoria, they've broken the line and tried to defend that way. However, they are not strong enough to be able to compete one-to-one. With this technique, you're basically trying to bully the opposing team and outmuscle them to the ball. Another way to defend it, as shown in between the France and Argentina game, is to play what is called a bracket defense. So the number of players play zonally, while a few other players play man-to-man, chasing down their runners, making sure that you generally, when the ball comes to you, have 2-to-1. This form of defense helps to prevent space for players to run into.
When it comes to sporting events, major sporting events, what was often talked about is the legacy of that event. The ironic thing about the legacy of the Qatar World Cup is that the legacy might have already started. Due to the appointment of Russia and Qatar having the World Cups, what we have seen is FIFA looking in on itself and being criticised for those results. FIFA in the process was exposed as being a corrupt organisation, and the Qatar and Russian World Cup bids were marred with alleged bribery. This has caused many of different other bodies to have an internal look upon themselves and their own actions, such as the World Athletics Association, taking a look at themselves at why did they give the World Championships in Eugene, Oregon without a bidding process, heavily sponsored by Nike. When it comes to autocratic dictatorships, they often get sidelined, inspired by symbols and symbolism, and focus heavily upon that rather than the effects upon other things in their nations. Those symbols become the forefront of their mind and imaginations, and to them they symbolise the nation. But of course they can also symbolise themselves, and they quite often, in the case of Putin, put them or try to place themselves as I am the nation, therefore anything against me is attack upon the nation. Now, I'm not saying Qatar has done that or is doing that, but what I am saying is that in the literature has shown and stated, and history has given us many examples where this has potentially been the case.
However, there are some prominent scholars and thinkers who do not take such an optimistic view that the World Cup could be used as a vehicle for change, and instead take a much more apathetic view.
There's a question about what World Cup players and officials should be doing in response to the obvious and blatant human and civil rights violations of the country where the World Cup is being held. I don't think it matters what they do. I'm not particularly supportive of people who have earned lots of money by supporting that regime, but it's already happening now. Every benefit that was wanted is gained. The people who died building those stadiums are already dead, and they can't be undeaded. Their families won't be reimbursed anymore because of any statement made. It's too late. If there was a moral position in football, it was murdered years ago. Principle isn't preserved because we're willing to talk about how bad the partnership is that we've engaged in. principle is preserved by not engaging in the partnership. And there are people out there who say, well, if we don't liaise with people who have kind of dubious regimes, then we'll never have any World Cups. Well, there's the principle.